One thing to keep in mind around social capital as a definition is that it's actually neutral, right? There's neither a positive or a negative attached to the concept of social capital. Ultimately, what social capital is a collection of social networks, values, and norms of reciprocity, cooperation, and trust that flourish within both networks and institutions. And when we think of social capital, one thing to think about is how it can actually be an interactive term, where it's the norms and systems and institutions that maintain our sense of being part of a community. And it's also transactive in terms of market enactments that are made possible by our connections to networks. So there's three types of social capital. Bonding social capital is where there's strong ties but low mobility. And an example of that is a family, folks that are really close together. But as a result of that, they don't necessarily go out of their circle. And so the mobility factor is lower. Bridging social capital is where there are so-called weak ties, which means that they're not bonding ties, but there's mobility. And so an example of bridging social capital are people in your club, in your social institution, at your church. And then there's linking social capital. And that's what we call also weaker ties, or the weakest ties, but very high mobility. And why is that? Well, because the people that are not necessarily either bonded or bridged to you in your network, there are people that maybe are from the outside that you don't necessarily have a direct connection with. As a result of that, of course, they're going to bring you into new networks and new institutions and expose you to new things. And so these three forms of social capital, bonding, bridging, and linking, are helpful when we think about how we use social capital, and in some ways also how it prohibits us from doing things, right? And so it's important to recognize when I talk about social capital being neutral, not either positive or negative, is that, again, back to this idea that it can be both interactive in the norms and the values that we use, and also transactive in terms of what it allows us to do. So it's a complex term, really, when you think about it. It has a lot of dimensions to it. It isn't just an asset, it's also something that we're thrown into. We don't necessarily choose the institutions that we're born into. And so sometimes social capital can be a liability when we're associated to a group that somehow is not acknowledged or recognized or is not helpful. And of course, the opposite is true. We have really entered a time where we have this idea that somehow the social capital that we hold on to is fixed. We can't do anything about it. We can't use it to go across an aisle or go across a network or get to know other people. And so therefore, there's this sort of fear of the other. And then, of course, when it comes to faith and church communities, what is the role of the church in all this, right? And so in some ways, I would just argue that churches can redefine social capital from the perspective not just of fundraising or impact in terms of money and in terms of status and in terms of networks, but also in terms of beloved community, as the ties that bind us to one another simply by being imago Dei, that the church's relevance really can be reshaped as an active citizen in the brokenness of our society. And so social capital can also be what we call a discursive bridge, a term to help us connect institutions where we feel loss and belonging where we feel exclusion.